We're picking up in chapter 32, Job, and I think Brian and Elliot have both reminded us it's a kind of a really digging in on the thought of experience the book of Job as kind of a dramatic play. And for me, that's been helpful because I don't know if you guys are like me. I could be unique and individual in this way, but sometimes you read the first, 30 chapters of Job and you're like, man, this is just, we're just beating this horse. Job is struggling. He's finding his, innocence and stating his claim. And his friends continue to batter against him. And it gets a little, exhausted. But when you think about it, in a way of trying to hollow out and silo that relationship between Job and God, which is eventually where we're going. I think that's why we're laboring this point, of him grappling with what's happened to him, the suffering that he's going through. And then, the dialogue is really close. I think, Brian left me a little bit of softball on the schedule here because we're about to really, he wants an answer from God. That's what he wants, right? He's reaching out. He doesn't understand. He can't understand. And he's just to the point of exhaustion, in these first. And now, at the start of this, chapter 32, they've stopped talking. They've stopped talking. And, I think we can find ourselves in that same situation, right? Where we just, we beat our head against the wall for a certain amount of time, and we're in a period of our life where we're struggling or we're finding, something difficult to understand. And, I think that's where we're at, with Job right now in chapter 32. And it's not over. It's not over because we're going to have, one more character kind of introduce himself here and come at it from a different angle. Just to recap, Job has endured almost all the loss that you can imagine, right? I mean, at this point, emotionally, physically, maybe not all the way physically, right? He's not all the way there, but he's in extreme pain. He's in extreme pain, extreme sorrow, mental anguish. I think Melanie put it well last week. You just can't really, it's hard to even fathom where he's at emotionally and physically. You read things or you see things. Just this week, I think there's a family that probably many of you have seen, on social media who's experienced the loss of a child, and, just someone close to our community. And, you can't even relate to it, right? It's just such a traumatic, an emotion that you can't hardly process. And then you think about Job, who's experienced that on top of all the other loss. And then his friends, his wife, who have said, this is it, you're in the wrong. His wife said, there's nothing left for you to do other than to just curse God and let it go. And so we're at that point. Now spiritually, has Job given up at this point? Emotionally, mentally, he's beat down. Physically, but spiritually, is he there yet? What's your thoughts?
I think that's the last thing he's got to hold on to, so he hasn't let go of it yet.
Right. I kind of like it to he's almost in like a Hail Mary desperation mode. Hail Mary is like a football term for those of you who haven't put some things in that terms. But he's in desperation. He hasn't given up. He's not left. He's searching and asking and continues to want to know. He hasn't given up. And so, that's where we find ourselves with Job right now. So then we're going to introduce Elihu. And Elihu's kind of the last of kind of the four friends. He's definitely set apart from the other three, not only in Scripture, but in kind of the way he goes about this discussion. So before, for those of you who studied Job before, for any who read before, class, what are some of your first thoughts about when you think of Elihu? You guys have any from previous studies about what you kind of think of when you hear the name Elihu?
Very angry young man.
Yeah, right? Angry, very angry, wrath used, young, for sure.
He calls these others, calls all of them very old.
Yeah, right. He'd be sure to, he's definitely sure to mention their age, their lack of, wisdom in this situation, their lack of success in making sure that Job understands his place. Angry and young, I kind of translate that as, Elihu has some serious energy, right? Like, we kind of describe that in today's world, like you get around somebody who has a presence, you can, feel their confidence, you can feel their energy, whether it be someone who's super positive, someone who's super negative. I think we'll continue to see this young, angry, but also confident. He's almost, and we read here in a minute, he just is bursting at the seams to speak, to help, to tell what he knows about the situation. He obviously has a strong connection with God and the Spirit. That's something we'll see outlined here. He's got a lot to say, for sure. He has a lot to say. All of his friends have had a lot to say. Elihu, we'll see in just a minute. He takes almost this entire first chapter, 32, to say, I've got something to say. It's all this whole verse to say, this whole chapter to say, I'm about to tell you something. So, he's got a lot to say. And in some ways, I think it's a little bit misunderstood. Because, go ahead.
I was just going to say on the positive side, I think he's sat through and listened. He's apparently been there the whole time, all the speeches that we've gone through so far. So he sat patiently and listened. It appears that his anger has just been building, still no answers.
Yep, that's exactly right. Yeah, and so that's right. That's why where I was going is there's some misunderstanding because he definitely waits his turn. He's definitely patient. He has this strong connection with God. When I think about being misunderstood, the first impression, right, is he's angry and he's young and he's got all the answers. I think we'll find as we go through this chapter and certainly through next Wednesday night, that of all the friends who are probably most closely aligned with what God has to say in response to Job would be Elihu. Not that he's perfect and he's got all the answers and he's 100% right. But when you think about how he says, what he says, and the angle that he comes from, he's very closely aligned. So I think it's definitely a disservice to just think of him as, this young kid who's got it all figured out. He's angry and I'm giving you the answers and these are the answers and this is what you got to do. Not that that's not a part of him as well. So, we start there in 32, and he's saying to these men, look, you guys have been sharing your wisdom with Job, and you've had no success. And it's my turn. It's my turn to talk. Listen to me. I've got something to say, and I think it's what we want to have happen in all of our. Anytime we wait our turn to speak, we really want to clear the floor, right? We really want to, everybody listen to me. I don't know if you guys have been in that situation with your kids or, others at work or, different activities. Sometimes you hear a lot of people talking, right? And I don't know, for me, sometimes it happens you sit in a meeting and everybody's got solutions and then, you're waiting your turn to say, well, I think I know what we should do. And that's where Elihu's at. He's I've got some things figured out. You guys have all had your chances to figure it out. And, now let's listen up. Let's listen to me. So, first, has anybody ever been around someone like that? Has that ever been you? You guys ever been around someone who comes off right away as, I've got all the answers and I've got things figured out? Has that ever been you when you're young and in that situation? I've been there sometimes. I've been there sometimes thinking, it's again, not a bad thing. I know my family's in this class too. They could probably tell you some stories about when I think I'm right or when I know I'm right. And sometimes when I'm definitely not right, you know? And, you know, Elihu is that way in many of us. I'm sure we've all been passionate to the point of where we see something happening that we know is wrong, and we want to help and we want to fix it. And that is his goal. His goal is to help resolve this problem that Job is having of not coming to terms with his sin, right? Because that's still, you can't fix the suffering, you can't fix any of the other problems, but what he can fix and what he's trying to fix is, Job, you're not understanding, right? You're in the wrong. You are in the wrong. And until we repair that relationship here, we're not going to get anywhere. But he definitely does it in a different way. So, you know, I think that's chapter 32. You know, mainly, like I said, we spend some time understanding who this man is, what he's about, what his goal is. So, any other thoughts about Elihu or, you know, learning from that time of your life when, you know you have the answers and maybe how you're going to proceed from, you know, giving that advice to others?
I think we've all been there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think it's definitely it's almost too common, right? I mean, maybe not all of us. Maybe there's some of you guys that have always been just the mild-mannered friend who can be relied on to just help hold someone's hand patiently and take them all the way through the conflict. But, you know, for most of us, we can relate to being that person who's just like, you got it wrong, and I've got to help you figure it out. And that's who Elihu is. And he's young, confident, brash. It is true, he's upset, right? He's angry. He's angry at the other elders who he's been listening to, who've got it completely wrong. And he's angry at Job that he doesn't have it understood. So, we'll go on to chapter 33, right? In chapter 33, Elihu starts to build out his case. He starts to, you know, do things, and we learn how he's a little bit different, right? So, we'll just read 1 through 7 there and talk about it a little bit. It says, "But now, Job, listen to my words. Pay attention to everything I say. I'm about to open my mouth. My words are on the tip of my tongue. My words come from an upright heart. My lips sincerely speak what I know. The Spirit of God has made me. The breath of the Almighty gives me life. Answer me then if you can. Prepare yourself and confront me. I am just like you before God. I too have been taken from clay. No fear of me should alarm you, nor should my hand be heavy upon you." So with that intro, right, what is a little bit different about that intro statement and the others? The other friends. What strikes you as a little bit different?
What is the first one to mention Job? I'd say, Job, I am now talking to you.
Yep.
Whereas his other friends just are like, you almost get this idea of, hey buddy, you know, but Elihu is very pointed at what he has on his mind, and so he says Job.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he addresses him more directly, it seems like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point.
It almost seems like you kind of relate to him too, like, you have no fear of me. I'm here to talk this through with you because, you know, I'm trying to understand where you're at, but I'm not coming here to judge you. We're going to figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah. That to me is one striking difference in the beginning, right? He's trying to, not that the others their heart was necessarily in the wrong place, right? Because we know the very first time they saw Job, I mean, they wept as he wept, right? So I don't want to give them such a bad name, right? But then in their arguments, they immediately do what? Immediately.
Judge him as being guilty.
Immediately. I mean, immediately. They just jump right in, right? There's a problem. Here are the problems. You are responsible for the problems. Take responsibility. Elihu says, I'm no different than you. I'm no different than you. Your maker is my maker. You should not fear me in any way, fear my words in any way. So it's obvious, too, that he comes at that in a different way. Now, why is that odd? We just talked about Elihu, right? We just talked about who he is, what God described him as, and then we got that intro. What doesn't match?
You would think the wiser, older person would have be on a higher spiritual plane. It seems like he's on that footing instead of the older three friends.
By the way, yeah, you would, someone who's young and who's angry does not seem like the type of person, right? That's just going to be very measured and say, hey, we're on the same team, right? At least not me. I can tell you that. If I'm angry with someone and I feel like I want to tell them something, and definitely in my youth, I would have immediately said, listen up. Listen up. Something that I would have wanted to grab their attention, right? And that's definitely something I've had to work on over the years a lot, right? Not because I have a natural inclination to think I'm better, because I can tell you I don't. I think many, not that at all. It's just sometimes you just skip that part, right? And you're just like, something's wrong. Listen up. I've got the answer. And, Elihu starts differently. He says, look, we're on the same page. We're on the same team. I want you to listen to what I say. And so, just great advice for us, right? I mean, how many different conversations are we going to have in our lives with, hundreds of people? Our family, our children, not family, not children, all those in the world who may have wronged us, right? Elihu's he's not the one that's been wronged, right? He just had to sit there and listen to it. How many of us get to situations where we have been wronged, right? Or something's happened to our children, or to our family, or to someone we love, right? It's hard to stop and be like God in that moment and say, we're on the same team. We need to work on this together, right? So it's just, that sticks out to me strongly as something we need to, consider about Elihu. As angry as he was, maybe as inexperienced as he was, he starts in a place of love and understanding and saying, we are the same. We are the same. And then,
would you say that his anger was righteous anger, and that's why it was more in a useful manner? It's not that anger itself is wrong. There's different types of anger.
mm-hmm.
It says he's angry. Yeah, Jesus was angry.
Right.
So he was angry at the situation, maybe not angry with the individual. He saw what was going on. He stood back and he observed.
Mm-hmm.
He was angry at the situation
Mm-hmm.
from maybe more of a righteous stance, which is why he was able to have a clearer mind when he did speak and speak more.
Yeah, I definitely think that tone is strong in the anger that we see here described as someone who is angry, but angry for the right reason, angry because he can't get things figured out. And so, yeah, I think definitely giving him some clarity, for sure. I think we would attribute that not only to, being very strongly connected to the Spirit, as he says, and then other times, right, you have to be careful, too, to just wipe off and say anger is, it's always easy to go right there, right, because it's hard to control. It's hard to control your anger at all times, and, being someone who's just, easily, provoked. But in this case, I don't think that that's the case, right? I mean, who knows for sure? We could have been here for, 2 weeks at this point. We know for a week they all just sat there, right? So, definitely some righteous anger, I think, is a good descriptor of where he's at. Melanie?
Yeah, when I read through this a little bit, I feel like he's very involved in this situation, even though it's not him, And so I kind of have to wonder if there's some fear in
Yeah.
this, in him trying to sort this out.
Mhm.
And even with his other friends, you kind of wonder, like, they thought they understood how things worked.
Mhm.
They thought they knew Job. They're trying to put the pieces together. But here's this young man looking at this and thinking, I mean, this is a scary situation to look, to see, how did you get here? Because I don't want to get there.
Right.
And I would think that there's some fear in that.
Mhm.
And it even seems like, some of his comments later on about kind of saying who he is. He thinks he's like Job.
Right.
Well, he's saying the things that Job's saying about himself too. They're both kind of saying, I'm upright, I'm doing,
Right.
and I just wonder if that, the anger or whatever, if that just comes from a place of fear too,
Right.
and trying to sort it out and make sense of it.
Yeah, I think that's I mean, it definitely makes sense. A lot of times when something happens so dramatic, everybody's trying to find the answer, get the answer. Now, not only that, he's listened to the others, and it's like Job's not budging. Something's wrong, and I got to figure it out and be unsettled by that situation. And I definitely think, he's unsettled. I think being angry, being fearful of, you better listen. You got to listen, because if we don't figure this thing out, foundationally, we know Job's a very powerful man and where he comes from. And so I definitely think that makes some sense, for sure. So he starts there, and then immediately he transitions, in 8 through 12. And we'll just read one there, and he says, in 8 and 9, but you have said in my hearing, I heard the very words, I am pure and without sin. I am clean and I am free from guilt. Yet God has found fault with me. Right? So what's the starting point of his argument? Right? What's the very starting point?
Job, you've declared your own righteousness.
Exactly. What were the others?
You've obviously sinned.
Yep. Right? So the other friends are past tense. Right? They are past tense. Job, something was wrong in all. They went at it from lots of different ways. Right? You obviously something's wrong. You've sinned. You didn't realize it. You're being punished. They all go at that from different angles. And Elihu kind of takes that part away, right? And says he doesn't deal with it at all. And I don't think it's because, well, I know it's not, because he thought maybe that was part of the argument. No, he says that you guys are wasting your time. Right? You guys have been unsuccessful. Job, you're rebelling in the face of God, proclaiming your innocence, saying you're pure and you're free. No one can do that. No one can do that. Certainly not man. Certainly not man. And he's going to develop that argument as we go from here. But right away, very clean, very concise argument to say, look, you think you're pure. You think you're right. You've proclaimed that to all of us. And that alone is your downfall. That is where your sin lies, Job. Who among any mortal can proclaim their innocence to God? And it's the truth, right? I mean, that's the truth. And that's where I think when I talk about Elihu being a little bit misunderstood, right? Being young and angry, but he's so clear-minded. And at least it's me that I'm going to kind of jump in front of on Wednesday night, but God has a lot of the same thing to say to Job. A lot of the same. His point is exactly the same. Who are you to question me? Who are you to think, to understand why or how any of this, could happen to you? And so, I think that's an absolute, really strong argument that Elihu starts with. So any thoughts on that?
I started a little bit a couple of classes ago, and I've been thinking about it, about how he went on and talked about all the things that he has done. And it was very much like, it was very much egotistical to me. And I thought, okay, so Job's a righteous guy, yet he's obviously boasting in all the things he's done as if he's better than everyone. And here's this younger guy who's going to keep quiet and just sit there, and he's seeing these older, wiser men go back and forth, and he's watching Job basically say these things. And from, if I'm in his shoes, I would think like, so you think you're better than everybody.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you're not above the system.
Yeah.
And I think that's where his anger, it's like, you know, you're not man to man.
Right.
We're the same. Like,
Mhm.
you're not better. And
Yep.
you've got to see that just because you've done these amazing things.
Yep.
But yet he's still called righteous. So it's still kind of like confusing to me.
Well, I think you're right. I think you're right. And I think you made a comment on Wednesday night to think about his righteousness, and was his righteousness in suffering, you know, and we know Job was righteous, right? We know he was. That's declared. So was his suffering to make sure he was righteous? I think that was kind of the question. That, or like, you know, could you even be righteous without suffering? I think that's kind of one of the things you were talking about on Wednesday night. And in a way, well, we know Job was righteous, right? We know that. Without suffering, we know that he was blameless. But then you get to the point, right? As he goes through this trial, there's where he starts to lapse and suffer and become, you know, self-righteous. And that's where Job's at. You know, in my opinion, at this point, and that's why Elihu is right. Job, you've gone too far in proclaiming your own innocence, and that you've done all of these wonderful things. And of course, you've done these wonderful things. You have, but those two things don't matter. They don't together. They're not a justification to God for your suffering. And I think that's a great point, for sure.
I agree, but can you blame him?
No, no,
I mean,
no. You cannot. Yeah,
it's quite the scene
yeah.
where they're coming down on him.
Oh, absolutely. No, that's exactly, just think about, as we said in the beginning, not only that, not only everything he's been through, and then to know the first point, to know that you were doing everything you could do, right? No, I certainly don't blame you for thinking, I have done everything, and I know I have. And has it all been for nothing? And now I've got all these people here telling me I've done things wrong, and I know I haven't, right? No, it's easy. It's easy for us all to fall off that cliff. And that was my next point about, you know, kind of the whole entire situation, right? You can't fault Job at all in those moments for, I mean, how many times, just me, I'm sure, where I didn't even realize I was wrong. And immediately I'm like, who are you to call me out? Tell me I'm wrong. You know, that's definitely maybe a negative characteristic of mine, a little bit, you know, maybe a little touchy if you think I'm wrong. And then right away, you know, Job has got it coming from every angle, every single angle. And so, no, I don't think you could fault him at all. The one,
You know, they probably still what you're going to talk about Wednesday night, but
Yeah.
you know, the spoiler alert, when you get to the end, God condemns the other three, but you don't see Elihu being condemned.
that's right.
So we obviously need to, as you're talking about, pay attention
Yeah, that's what,
to the way he's approaching it.
that's exactly right. And that's what, it wasn't even going to be Wednesday. It was just going to be about 9 minutes before we were getting there, you know? Because that's exactly right. I think what we're learning about Elihu here is, and I didn't even want to spend a ton of time, right, as Elihu fleshes out all of his arguments, because God's going to flesh those out here in the next. But ultimately, he's got it pegged pretty quickly and rightly in that, look, that we don't have a lot of other faults. It's just this one right now. It's just this one that we got to get cleared up, and trying to explain away why things happen, you know, and proclaim your own innocence. You're exactly right. And so, yeah, go ahead, Ron.
I think we also need to recognize that we don't need to dismiss the younger people and what they have to say. I mean, I've learned so much from my children. Cora's called me out since she was 5 years old. So, I mean, she's always been an adult.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, I mean, we need to make sure we give them their say and
Yeah, absolutely.
their place.
Yeah, well, that's a great point. That's a great point for all of us can sometimes easily, not just our own children, younger people in the church, younger people in our lives. Obviously, our kids are like little mirrors to us, you know, sometimes they can definitely show us our wrong in 1 second. But to just dismiss youth as ignorant, it would be completely foolish. Not only because of all the instruction we've given by Jesus in the Bible to, you know, understand that there's a reason he loved children, and there's a reason that he said to the youth as they're growing up, don't let that be an excuse for yourself, because you've got wisdom to share. That's a great point, Ryan. So we'll continue to develop, you know, that point. Just spend a few more minutes. You know, one of the things that is present in 34 and 35, and we think about, you know, Elihu's, his philosophy about suffering, you know, we'll talk about that. And then you're really in 34. If you were to sum up 34 in general by looking at, you know, just a couple verses, we'll talk through real quick. And again, it's the same theme, right? Job says, I am innocent, but God denies me justice. Although I am right, I am considered a liar. Although I am guiltless, his arrow inflicts an incurable wound. What man is like Job, who drinks scorn like water? And so, again, he's really continuing to develop here. You know, Job has kind of developed an arrogance throughout this, you know, this state. And we've talked about that. 34 really kind of goes to explain more and more about what he thinks about being in God's control.
Which kind of makes sense, right? Like, we don't always understand why Satan chose Job, but when you start to think about this part of the discussion, it kind of brings to light that Satan knew exactly what he was doing, because he knew what Job thought about himself, which you don't always think of. You don't always think of Job in a negative way. We always talk about like how good he was and how terrible it is these things happened to him. But I think there's obvious reasons that Satan went to God and said, well, let me, you know, do all my harm, and let's see how he comes out on the other side.
Yeah, and I think whether it was, you know, about Job or about anyone, because again, we know Job's character, but I think he knew that men, humans, pushed to a certain point, you know, always resist, you know, that, and, you know, hold to what they think of themselves as being right, instead of just continuing to lament and woe and say I'm sorry. It's to kind of not first nature. And then certainly, you know, you could make that application for sure about Job, you know, a wealthy man who's been given a lot, who had, you know, lots of things. Again, you always hate to go too far in that judgment, right? Because we know Job was a righteous man. We know that he was. But men are men. And that's why we always will fall short. Always. Even Job, who was the greatest man, you know, in the East, as described. When he's put through this fire, he handles most of it, right? He handles most of it, all you could think of. But ultimately, where he starts to really fall short is just, he wants to know why, and he thinks he deserves to know why. And that's where we fall short, Elliot.
Yeah, Nick, Job's like one of those people that I think of as like an almost untouchable character, you know, throughout the Bible. And so it's hard whenever I read this to think, oh, this guy's not trying to be self-righteous. He's just trying to ask why. And what's wrong in asking why? You know, don't we all ask why? But I think in these particular chapters, you start to see where that has crossed over. And it's tough, right? It's kind of like one of your heroes getting banged up here, and you're thinking, poor guy. I mean, you know, to Randy's point, he's trying to understand what's going on. His friends are bagging on him, but he's clearly turning the page now.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's a great point, right? Because we all want to, you're definitely in Job's corner immediately, right? And you can understand why he's crying out, you know, and even as he begins to falter here, you know, you want to plead and understand with him, but it's absolutely true that he's laying out that Job's biggest problem is that he's, you know, as you read in chapter 34, you know, right there in verses 31 and 37, you know, he says, To his sin, he adds rebellion. Scornfully, he claps his hands among us and multiplies his word against God. So, in chapter 34, 35, 35, he kind of goes on to spend a lot of time talking about God's justice and who God is, knowing that God is a just God. And that's where his argument continues to line up again with God. Because we know what about God? We know what? He is blameless. He is just. Right? And Job seems in this line of why? How could this happen to me? Look at all I've done. Seems to lose sight of the fact that no matter his suffering, that we do have a perfect God. We do have a just God. We do have one who's weighing those scales, and no matter how far we feel they become imbalanced against us, that there's no way that the one that we trust has it wrong. He doesn't delight, some of those verses in 36, he doesn't delight in evil. There's no way. God doesn't delight in evil. He doesn't delight in your suffering. He doesn't delight in any of that, right? Even he fleshes out in 36 between the wicked and the meek, right? To God, he's offering that judgment the same, And certainly he's punishing the wicked, and he does punish the wicked, but that's not a question for Job, to ask. And to ask for an explanation is kind of the last part that we start to talk about here as we're going the wrong way. And we think about, and we'll spend more time, but 37 kind of moves us towards the first 7 verses there. If you just look over them quickly, right? They start to move so we can't talk about how God is imperfect. We can't talk about, him not being just. We can talk about how powerful he is, right? And so he starts to really lay some of the framework for, God being an all-powerful. He talks about, Melanie?
One thing that is kind of interesting, because if you go back to the beginning when he lost his children and things are falling apart, he is able to say, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. It's something about this pressure cooker of life. It's just the pressure keeps building on him. And we all have a breaking point, it seems. And it just seems like, early on, that would be a lot of people's breaking point, and that wasn't Job's breaking point.
Right.
But the pile on, and the suffering. His wife had a breaking point. It was earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And she went through the same stuff. She lost her children. She lost, her wealth and his health, and she was suffering those same things. She had a breaking point. But it seems like Job, Satan knows we have a breaking point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right. Even Job, Elliot mentioned here, as a hero, we found it. We did, and we all have it, for sure. So we'll continue in 38 and 39 on Wednesday night. So we appreciate you guys' thoughts.